My name is Larissa. I've been working with windows for the majority, well, most of my adult life. I've worked in all sorts of different areas doing design drafting, from estimating through to production drawings. I've written blogs about them professionally. I've written technical manuals. I've worked with people from the factory through to architects. I've worked with manufacturers of joinery, gaskets, glass, the whole lot, the whole works. I've actually had a very wide a wide variety of actual input into the industry and learning in the industry. And so what I have developed is a passion for getting windows right and doing them in the way that actually glorifies them to the full extent that they should be. And so I would like to pose, what do you consider when you think about glazing? Essentially, there are no construction projects made without them, ever. It's an essential part of a build. But what the discussion is that we have with our clients is often very limited. We need to actually open that up to actually understand more of why we need to talk about people about their glazing, as well as understanding the regulations and things that actually go along with that. Now, in Australia, there are quite a few. Globally, I think that would change from country to country, but we're going to have a look a little bit at that tonight and get a little bit better of an understanding. So essentially, glazing will create the look and the feel of a building. They'll permit the use of a building. They provide security to its inhabitants, and they provide the experience of the building to those same inhabitants. Then there's the dichotomy. They provide us with a connection as well as a barrier to the environment. There's plenty of proof of their importance in the building envelope. However, there seems to be a disconnect between the reality of what is needed and what is built, what they're prescribed to be and what is being purchased. Now, I've actually had a couple of people talk about that this morning. We had Corey and we had Esther actually talking about the importance of actually making sure you're getting what you're buying. So when we think about glazing, what do we consider? We look at the aesthetics, the frame, the material, the size, the finish, the glass, visibility, what you see in, what you see out, the views. We talk about expense. We talk about air circulation, operable versus fixed glazing. We talk about security, whether they're lockable, whether they're screens or bars. We talk about safety, house fires, fall protection, bushfire. We talk about the usability, the circulation space around them, the hardware used, the experience of the building participant, or the biophilic design, which we heard about earlier from Matilda. We talk about the acoustics. We can talk about the accessibility for people with disabilities. We can talk about the protection, the structural integrity, or the debris impact. We can talk about the environmental conditions or the weather and keeping the rain or the water out, in particular with this design from at a hotel concept done in Mexico, I believe. So all of these areas we actually do look at in Australia, and we actually have regulations and we have compliance that we need to actually follow in order to make sure that our clients and our buildings are made to fit those regulations. All of this needs to be understood by the designers and the clients, so the correct decisions can be made and then conveyed to the people making the glazing, so that correct products can be quoted, supplied, and installed. The thing is, we have the technology and the power to address all of these issues. We've heard from some fantastic people today. We heard Samantha about some amazing glazing products. PC Thomas was talking about the wicked ways of air conditioning, and we know how we can actually control that with our glazing. Today, I'm going to discuss the importance of one of these aspects, the thermal impact. The reason why is I'm living in one of the most environmentally aware areas of Australia, the region around Byron Bay. Yet when I speak to glaziers, their prices take the protection stipulated for their thermal protection purely to be competitive on cost. I was really quite surprised about that, and I've spoken to a couple of people in the last week, a couple of weeks, and when I thought, okay, we need to actually address this. And so I thought I would maybe bring a bit of a heightened awareness about this and about the problems that we're actually getting, that disconnect. But tonight, as we're a global audience, I thought thermal is something that actually we all are impacted by. So I decided to look up some information. I found some quite surprising facts. So I'm actually going to start by looking at the global picture for our global audience. So you can see in this graph here, it shows us the CO2 that we actually have, our emissions, and it shows us how drastically it has actually changed over the last 20 to 30 years. And what that means is a raise in the greenhouse effect. But the International Energy Agency, who actually, where I got this graph, they talk about, or they report that almost 2/3 of the countries lacked mandatory building codes in 2019. They say that approximately 5 billion square meters of buildings were built without mandatory performance. So that means that they have no restrictions or nothing to bind that energy requirement. So what was built to a standard? About 275 million square meters. And that makes out about 5.5% of the buildings that have been built. So that's a very small portion of the buildings that actually do require mandatory building energy codes. So if we are living in a country that have those mandatory codes, but people are trying to get away from that, that to me is quite a scary prospect. So now I'm going to take us and we're going to visit the Earth Observatory. So you'll just have to bear with me while I find it. It was right here before I started. Here we go. Now I hope you can see that well enough. I know you're looking at my entire screen, but this here shows us what happens with the carbon emissions. Now, look, I know that we've probably all seen this before. Now, this is quite some time ago. We can see it's fairly stable, a little bit of heating here and there, but that's apparently a normal anomaly. But what happens is after the 70s and 80s, and this is what really sort of started to really grab me, because I haven't seen this information now for quite some time laid out in such a literal fashion. But you can see now it's starting to get very golden. It's starting to get very warm. And that is the problem that we had. Now, this is in 2019. So the importance of the energy, I'm hoping that if you haven't seen that before, it really does give you a very good idea on why this is actually such a topical issue. And obviously there's so many people speaking about it today, but it really brings it to the fore. Now this is, I'm going to probably mispronounce this, the Köppen-Geiger climate map. Now, this has been used since 1961. It's updated from time to time, and it gives us a little bit of information about what's happening where. Now, we are talking from Australia, so I'm going to concentrate on Australia from this point on, but you can see how Australia compares to the rest of the world. And in the top right-hand corner, you can see how Australia's size as well as the climatic conditions compare. And we do have quite a range of climatic conditions that we have to deal with here. So when a glazier tells me they couldn't quote on lower windows because other companies weren't, who is to ensure that this is included in the build? Who pays for this in the long run? I want to now take you to what happens in Australia and some figures that I was shown a couple of years ago from the Australian Fenestration Training Institute. They talk about the building envelope and how much of that is made up by glazing. And you can see down the bottom there, it says about 8%, 1% is doors, not necessarily all of them are made of glass, but it's nice to actually include it. So that's less than 10% of the actual building envelope is taken up by glazing. But when we actually have a look at the share of heat loss, that actually then starts to look at more like 50%. So it's a fair amount of heat that is actually lost through glazing if it's not protected. The really scary figure though is when we actually look at the heat gain. Now, this is Mr. P.C. Thomas's Wicked Houses. These Wicked House design, this is the problem, is that we have almost 90% of the heat is gained through our windows. The information, this is the reason why that the NCC is looking at glazing and is starting to really stress the importance of using energy conservation and programs like NatHERS and the building energy, or there's a range of energy products out there that we can use. But this is the reason why it is so important. And I think it's a really good reminder of why we should be actually paying a little bit more attention to our windows. The problem though that I did bring up was that disconnect between what we want and what is actually quoted for and built. Part of what I have seen after doing a couple of years of consultation and specification with designers and architects is the fact that glazing information is usually documented in a really sporadic fashion. There'll be a little bit of information on bushfire over here, and then you'll have some acoustic information over there, and then they'll talk about screens on some of the drawings. It can be, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's missing, sometimes it's just scattered. But what we need to do is start to look and take our glazing, or we need to take our glazing information a lot more seriously and have a look at how we can actually make that simple. So I have been working on some documentation that I can sort of disseminate that actually helps people coordinate that glazing information a little bit more carefully. It also helps with specification of Australian standards to make sure that they're taken into account, so we have quality in our glazing. We need to start looking for products that Samantha was talking about. We need to look at the solutions that can actually bring our glazing so it is the jewel in the crown. Glazing should reflect light, enhancing beauty, and inherently increase the value of an area. Glazing should be like, as Matilda spoke about earlier, and it should connect us to the world, a world that we want to be a part of. So it's important to actually start to look at, what do you want to see in your windows? Think about that next time you are talking to your clients and your architect or your clients, and to understand what, not only where they're coming from, and as in their sustainable interests, but how we can actually cement those interests and carry them through not only the design process, but to the build. So I feel very strongly and very passionately about this. So I offer training. I do offer help with specification and window schedules. I have done a lot of consultation on projects, and so I'm available for all of those. I'm in the process of setting up some documentation at the moment. So I've just started working on my website, but I've got a couple of different areas there that you can contact me on, or you can give me a call. But I'm hoping to see the positive changes that we are working hard in our energy requirements and in the NCC and codes. I'd like to see more of those actually reflected through. I know we've got the technology, I know we've got the ability. We just need to make sure we connect that technology with the end result. So thank you very much for having me. It's been, I don't know how long I've taken to actually go through all of that information. And I don't know if anybody's got any questions or anything they'd like to discuss.
Larissa, we've still got some more time if you felt that you haven't covered some points. It's not a problem at all.
Okay. Well, I'll go back then I might just sort of take it back so we can see that if I can. So yeah. So here we've got a little bit of bushfire in the top left. We do have the heating and the cooling. We've got the structural ability shown here with, you have deflection. We have your ultimate limit state. We have serviceability limit state. We have all kinds of things that we need to address when we actually look at glazing. And some of these are going to be life-threatening, like the actual serviceability and the ultimate of an area. A lot of people don't understand how that information is generated. They don't understand how or why that's important, or why we need to be looking at it, and how it's tested. And so that information can be vital to making sure your clients understand windows and what they're actually getting. Things like fall protection are something that we don't need to specify, but if you don't specify, you will get what the actual glazier provides you. Now, if that is not what the actual client wants, there can be a problem there that is completely brought around by ignorance and not understanding where they're needed and why. Universal design, and especially in glazing, that becomes important with hardware and sill design, to making sure that they're flush. But then if they're flush, you need to consider water. Now, that has changed a lot over the last 5 to 10 years. A lot of the times, many years ago, architects would be like, well, what do we do with it? Well, you have to drain it. And so people are understanding that concept now, but the best ways of draining it is something that I have looked at for quite some time. Even looking at the differences between the different types of glazing that are available. You have timber, we've got aluminium, and we've got UPVC. And each of those have a reason to be chosen or selected, at a range of reasons why you would actually have a look at those and choose them and select them. Acoustics is another one. Acoustics is something that it is regulated. There is information and provisions made and guidelines, but how important is that to your client? Is that, for some people, it's a comfort factor that they cannot live without. There are a lot of people that have a sensory needs that need to actually be addressed. So to understand the principles of what you choose when you're actually looking at glazing is something that you can pass on to clients, is another valuable asset. Has anybody got any questions or anything they'd like to discuss with me? I don't know.
Yeah, Larissa, I think that on one of your slides there, you showed the thermal imaging of windows. Yes. And I think that's such a great tool for people of today, because when you go and speak to clients, you talk about the heat loss and so forth in your homes, and the heat gain through the windows, and you actually can do that and show people. It's amazing to see what technology we've got available today, like this, as well as what PC Thomas showed us. And I think a lot of people get shocked when they would look at their home and use this thermal imaging camera to highlight, I guess, a lot of areas where they've got leakages in their homes. So
yeah, and you can even see in some of these images, you can see where the shading has taken effect. And shading, one facade may look like it's got a lot of heat, but it may be in direct path of the sun, and another area may be in shade. So it is a professional person that does actually look and address these issues, so they know and they can interpret the information correctly. But even in some of them, you can see that the eaves on some of the windows and the blinds and things like that make a marked difference on how that heat transfer does happen through windows. I've actually seen thermal imaging on some of the things that's Samantha was talking about with the thermally broken systems. And so you can see very clearly on the outside where the heat is coming through, and when it hits the actual framing system itself, where it actually is stopped. And you can see with double glazing or an IGU, you actually have that gap there, and you can see that gap. That's where the heat transfer stops. Low E glass, again, you can see the same thing, but that thermally broken system is really powerful. And systems that she was talking about, I wanted to write it down, I didn't at the time. The system that she had, and it was a system where they actually had a break, but it was around the frame itself. Now that's a very powerful way of actually reducing the energy efficiency. I want to learn more about that product because it is incredible now what they are making and designing and what they're looking at. When they look at thermal energy, they actually can do calculations on computers to see what that thermal transfer is going to be. And so that can actually be generated a lot more easily than, say, structural performance, or structural performance can generally be calculated, that can be engineered, but water performance, something that is an air infiltration is another one that it has to actually be physically tested so they can see what the water is going to do when it reacts and where it's going to impact on a glazing structure. A lot of people, there's insulation products now that are in glazing frames, but unless they're actually designed for a glazing frame in particular, you can't just put insulation inside a frame and expect it to actually act thermally or improve the thermal performance. What happens is those channels and those areas, those gaps and spaces that are in frames are there to actually divert water. And so if you've got insulation in them, then you just end up getting really messy, wet insulation, and it can cause problems if it's not properly designed for it. So they're very, very complicated and very technical. And it's well advised that you do speak to glazing manufacturers and suppliers if you do know of a product that does work, because they can give you all of that information. All of the testing information is readily available for people that have projects that need these products.
Thank you. That's great. And look, with these thermal imaging cameras, it's really good to be able to use on, I guess, retrofitting as well, because people are going to be able to see exactly where these homes are leaking and causing, these issues. So look, Larissa, thank you very much for coming on. We know that it's late here in Australia, but it's early around the world. I've just got a message from somebody in Colombia. So buenos dias to all of you in Colombia. Good morning. And thank you, Larissa.